Hi, everyone. I'm Nancy Gagne, Executive Director of the Community Coalition on Race, and I want to welcome you to this important workshop series and thank you for taking the time to attend, to learn, to be in conversation with people about these critical issues in racism and in discovering ways to deconstruct it. As you know, this is an increasingly important topic given the attacks on teaching history, on the misuse of the concept of critical race theory, on the recent attacks on the advanced placement courses in African American history, and in increasing resistance to other inclusive curricula. I want to thank the team of community volunteers of the Anti-Racism Committee who've worked so hard over many months to put this informative session together. And with that, we want to get to the work. So I'm going to turn this over to Barbara Velasquez, Coalition Trustee, Chair of the Community Engagement Committee, who will give you an overview of the series.
Hello, everybody. I'm so happy that we can work on this together. And thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday afternoon. Okay, so we're all here to talk about deconstructing racism. Our program explores how our society is infused by racist conditions and systems that impact us all behaviorally and psychologically, as well as what we can do about it. Why did we do this? Because we want to address the forces of white supremacy who rely on our ignorance to perpetuate their racist schemes, to, among other things, many other things, rewrite our history and deny and refuse accountability for the trauma caused by hatred, selfishness, and greed. Everyone, all races, all ethnicities can benefit from this workshop. And we are so pleased that we have a diverse audience in this workshop as well. Now, I just want to briefly introduce our anti-racism committee, who is responsible for putting this workshop together. Right now, I cannot see our screen, so I don't know if our committee members are on one screen or not, but you can raise your hand when I call your name. Judith Gaston, Kristen Lasanti, Mickey Murphy, who is going to be our main speaker for today, myself, Barbara Velasquez, and chair of the Anti-Racism Committee. And I also want to call in Judy Bernstein, who I think is here, who has contributed a great deal to this workshop. So briefly, I'm going to talk about the genesis of deconstructing racism. How we started out with a question of how to familiarize ourselves and others with 21st century racism versus 20th century racism. We are all everything we're doing is built on 20th century racism. However, 21st century has a completely different look to it. So at first we thought we'd get trained and share what we learned with everybody else. But then I don't know when we decided, hey, we can probably do this ourselves. Maybe it was while we were doing all the research we did, curated from our anti-racism support group reading list that we conducted in 2021. But what we did was we read a lot of information. We broke it down, what we read, into 4 areas, which include our culture of white supremacy, which you're going to hear about today and in 2 weeks from now, as well as how it is upheld and maintained. And that will be in the month of March. Then its impact on people of color and all of us, including the nation. And that's in April. And then what we can do to disrupt it, which is in May. To end, we hope to provide many opportunities for questions and discussions. Let us assume that everyone here has a positive mindset and is ready to learn. If bias shows up during our discussions, and we all have them, please regard it as your personal gifted opportunity to grow and learn. Let us all agree to respond to that person or persons with both love and wisdom in the same way that we would like to be treated. Okay, so now we're going to hear from our Kristen about our shared agreements.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm also managing the windows over here and they're going a little bit haywire. So let me see if I can reliably get these up onto the screen. And maybe Barbara, you can let me know if you're able to see this. One moment.
I am, okay.
Okay. All right. Are you able to see group dialogue agreements?
Yes.
Beautiful. Okay, everyone. So we would like to propose to you these group agreements that allow us to have an understanding of how we want to show up and be together in this vital and important conversation. So here are some of our suggestions. We're going to ask you to agree to these agreements or to let us know if you have any objections or amendments that you'd like to propose. So first, we are inviting you to show up and be all in for this, to be present, and to the extent possible, put away distractions. Of course, we know that things come up. We're going to be together for 2 hours today. So being as present as you can, and if you need to step away just to make sure, maybe turn off your camera, put yourself on mute so that we don't create distractions for others. We want to invite you to listen to learn. Everyone here has wisdom to share, and we're going to be creating opportunities for that wisdom to come forward. As we do that, one of my personal favorite agreements is take space, make space, which means know yourself. Know your communication tendencies, right? If you happen to be somebody who likes to sit back and hear what everybody else has to say and not take up a lot of space, your invitation is to take up more space. We want to hear from you. If you are someone like me who tends to be very vocal and has no problem being the first person into a conversation, your invitation is to make more space for other people. So balancing our speaking and listening, starting with knowing ourselves. And what our tendencies are. We want to stay local so that anything that we share comes from our direct experience. We're not going to be giving advice to other people or maybe speaking on behalf of other people or other populations. We want to make sure that we're showing up with deep respect, respecting everyone's experience and valuing it. Expecting and allowing discomfort is really important in this topic. We are going to get uncomfortable. If we aren't, we're probably not doing our jobs. And the good news is this is where learning happens, right? So absolutely attend to your discomfort and spend some time there and attend to the body, right? Really allowing ourselves to be present to the feelings and the sensations that are coming forward for us, particularly if they're connected to some discomfort, allows us to show up with real presence for one another, as well as to take care of ourselves. Confidentiality is also very important. This is a way that we create safety for one another. So we are going to be honoring confidentiality in this space with the notion of sharing the insight, not the source. So outside, if you are moved by the conversation that happens today, by all means, take those insights and share them with your community, with your loved ones, with your family. But don't name the person who shared the insight or the story that gave you that insight. We want to stay with racism. We're going to be exploring a lot of different dimensions, a lot of different isms, and our focus for this time is going to be on racism. So your facilitators you might find us bringing you back around to racism and white supremacy as our area of focus for the program. And finally, let's remember that there's no quick fix to this work. Awareness and change are going to take time. So we are running a marathon together, maybe in relay form, but it's not a sprint. So let's slow down and really be here together. Any questions or concerns about these agreements? You can pop them into the chat. We will absolutely take constructive feedback on these agreements going into future sessions, but I think for now, we can probably move forward. The one thing I'd like to say that Audrey had asked me to include was a technical note. You have the ability to choose the view that works best for you. So you can choose to have the screen be your full screen. You can choose to have other faces like the speaker space next to the screen. You can make those screens larger and smaller. We invite you to play around with that to make sure that you have the experience that you want to have that's going to be supportive for you in this conversation. I think that was it for me, which means we're turning it over to Mickey.
Before you turn it over to Mickey, Kristen, this is Audrey Rowe. We know that people are coming to this experience with basic different backgrounds. So what we'd like to do is have you take just a minute and take what we're calling our pre-survey. So I'm going to share with you now on all of your screens, you should see a survey, and there's no right or wrong answer. We just like you to quickly go through and mark the one area of these 5 items for you. Okay, if you would start now, you should be seeing on your screen. There are 5 questions, and then you're just going to mark whether for that particular question, your experience is nothing, a little, you have some knowledge, a lot, or expert. And then scroll down to the next question where we have a total of 5. I should be able to see on my end how many of you have finished. And then we're going to allow you enough time to think it through, and then we're going to go back and begin with Mickey and her wonderful presentation.
Yes, also this will help us to assess how well we're doing, and also will help in our efforts to deconstruct race. If we see that this is working really well, because you'll be given it after this month is done, survey, then that will help us tremendously in learning what ways are effective in helping to just deconstruct race.
Okay, you guys are doing well. We're almost there. Everybody's almost finished their pre-survey. We appreciate your cooperation. We've got 76% participation. Take your time and just give us your best answer. Okay. Give it just a second, a few seconds more, and then we're going to end the poll.
Thank you.
Okay, last chance. All righty. And can you guys see the results there?
Mm-hmm.
So we see the majority of you, the 41% of you have a little knowledge. 4% say you know nothing about this area. We even have a few experts among us as well. So we hope that at the end of this experience, we all will end being more enriched. Thank you for taking the time. And now to you, Mickey.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you, Nancy, Barbara, and Kristen. And good afternoon, everyone. I want to add my thanks to all of you for being here today. When we made this plan, we did not know it was going to be Super Bowl Sunday, but we appreciate your commitment and hope that this is a worthwhile pregame for you. Really, we want to thank you for committing to being in dialogue with us and with one another about this topic. We're excited for this series and this time together to investigate how we got to where we are today and why we have not made more progress on the issue of race and racism. As was mentioned in the welcome letter that you received, this series, and as Barbara mentioned, is a result of several months of research and collaboration. We read many articles together, and then we went off and did our own research to create our modules. And we're not historians. I'm not a lawyer, but we're passionate about anti-racism, and we've enjoyed the process of learning and creating and developing this course. So here I've shared with you just some of the sources of the information that I will be sharing today about the meaning, the origin, and the persistence of white supremacy. So I want to give you an overview of what we plan to cover in the next 2 sessions on white supremacy. We all know, the best laid plans, but this is where we hope to go so that we can touch on the history, the legal structure, and really the vastness of white supremacy in our culture. In this session, we're going to establish that race is not a biological reality, that whiteness has evolved over time, or who was considered white has evolved over time, that white supremacy was codified in our countries and state laws and is now infused in our systems, and that the current backlash against teaching history in particular is an outgrowth of a failure to reckon with white supremacy. In 2 weeks, we'll get back together. We'll talk about some more recent history, Jim Crow, and other modern examples of white supremacy. We're going to talk about white privilege and white fragility, and really think about overt versus covert white supremacy. Overt, mostly eradicated, covert, still very much a factor. And then we're going to think about what we can do to dismantle white supremacy and racism. So what is the definition of white supremacy? What are its origins? Does it still exist? Is it the same thing as racism? These are some of the questions that we're going to be grappling with in this first module of Deconstructing Racism. Our goal, as the course title states, is to deconstruct racism. But in order to dismantle or even understand racism, we have to know how we got here. To do that, we're going to have to pull up some roots that have been growing for hundreds of years. And we're going to have to understand the thinking and the flawed thinking that reinforced it and continues to fuel white supremacy and racism to this day. So before we do some introductions and get to know each other a little bit, I just wanted to address the question of, if this course is called Deconstructing Racism, why is this first module called White Supremacy? And that is, we have intentionally chosen to focus on white supremacy specifically for two reasons. One, because it's the ideology of white supremacy, this ideology that people with light or white skin are superior. This is what gave rise to treating people differently based on skin color, and then to the creation of race or racial categories as we know them. Many of you may be familiar with the author Ta-Nehisi Coates. One of his quotes that really resonates with me is that race is the child of racism, not the father. What that says is that there first was this notion that some people were better than others, that there was a hierarchy of people. Then came the flawed science that we'll talk more about, and the dubious categorizations to support those ideas, and then the language of race. So we chose white supremacy because it's foundational, and it really can't be disputed. It best describes the thought process that was operating as our country began to form. And sadly, we chose it because it is an ideology that operates insidiously still today. And I do want to make the point that this is an ideology or a reality that white people benefit from, whether or not they harbor any feelings or thoughts or perpetrate any acts of racism. So even white people who are vehemently anti-racist, people who work tirelessly and in partnership with people of color to dismantle racism, benefit from this ideology. So while some would prefer to think of white supremacy as an extreme ideology, something that's espoused by people on the fringe or extreme, like David Duke, for example, what we hope to establish is that it is an ideology that is absolutely central to the framing and the development of our country, that it is not at all fringe, it is core. So that's the why. We want to start now by taking a moment to do some introductions. We're going to be learning and sharing together for over a 4-month period. So it might be nice for us to get to know one another a little bit.
And Nikki, before they actually go into their groups to introduce themselves, once again, we're trying to understand better where everyone is here. So we have another quick poll for you. And the poll was going to explore Mickey's point about how much you have been exposed to the terms of white supremacy and white privilege. So if I can get out of my, here we go, I'm going to launch this poll and just give us your honest answer. This is your experience with the terms. You should be seeing on your screen now. There's only one question, and we're just asking you to indicate where you are on that continuum. Have you never heard of the terms or experienced them? Have you learned about it in some isolated situations? Do you use those terms in your own everyday life? And do you have some discomfort with the concept? And do you totally dismiss the whole concepts totally? Just want your honest opinions. These are anonymous, by the way. More than half of you have answered so far. We're getting there, close to 80%. We're at 80 now. Just a few more seconds and we'll share. We'll see where we all are as a group with this. 91%. Just a few more and we're going to end it. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results with you. So as you can see, most of us are familiar with the terms and we use them in our own personal interactions. And some of us have learned some things about it in limited situations. So I'll stop sharing and then we'll get back to the task at hand, which Mickey was getting ready to announce. That is that of getting to know each other. Are we there now, Mickey?
Yes. That's
okay,
right.
great. So what we're going to do is have you go into smaller groups of approximately 10, where you will be able to share some information. I have put into the chat, which I hope I will send to everyone, the things that we're asking you guys to share. And now I'm going to put you into your rooms. On your screen, you may see a little button that says join. Just click on that and you will appear in a room with 9 other people. For anyone who's entered our presentation after this grouping has been done, no worries, I will get you into a room. Thank you, and here we go.
Okay, I think we're all back. Thank you all for going through that exercise. I hope you met someone new and have a little bit of sense of the group that is joining you on this journey that we're all going on. I find that even when we get the warning that there's 1 minute, 58 seconds, I'm always still talking just as we get bounced back into the main group. But I think that's a good thing. So I wanted to start by going over a little bit of terminology. And it's not that all of this terminology will be discussed in this session this week, but over the course of the 4 months that we're together, there are some, let me just get this in front of me, sorry. There are terms that might come up that may or may not be familiar with everyone here. So I'm going to quickly go through them. The first one, and they're not in alphabetical order, they're in the order that they came to me as I was creating this presentation. The first one is BIPOC. And BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And it is pronounced as a word, not said as the letters, BIPOC. And it's intended to center the experiences of Black and Indigenous groups and also to demonstrate solidarity between communities of color. The next one is Latinx. It is meant to refer to a person of Latin American origin or descent. And it's used as a gender neutral or a non-binary alternative to Latino or Latina. And what's important to know here is that this is a term that's not embraced by everyone. There is controversy over the use of the term because of the fact that this X would not be the ending of a word in the Spanish language, so it's sort of an imposition. And there are many people who prefer Hispanic to Latinx, but it is a term that is coming into wider use, but it's important to understand that. Lived experience is really the personal knowledge about the world that is gained from direct firsthand experience, involvement in everyday interactions and events, rather than understanding people through representations made by others. And lived experience can often be discounted in favor of written representations gathered by other people through research, observation. The idea with lived experience is to listen to the people for whom the issue, whatever it is, has a direct impact. Caucasian is a word that we're going to come back to in a little bit. It's an obsolete racial classification of human beings based on what is now disproven, which is this theory of race being biological. It is not biological, so this classification no longer has meaning. It really never did. But I think understanding that it's an obsolete term is important. Anti-Blackness is a particular form of racism. It really is, attitudes, actions that devalue, minimize, marginalize Black people. And it's problematic because people, the sort of the paradigm of anti-Blackness positions Blackness as problematic. And it also just doesn't take into account the severe disadvantages that Black people have experienced as a result of racism, both historically and contemporarily. Colorism is prejudice or discrimination against people with dark skin tone. And it can often be within a group. Colorism can happen or be prevalent among people of the same ethnic group. But it is rooted in and it perpetuates white supremacy in that it privileges and upholds Eurocentric beauty standards. So things like lighter skin, narrower nose, straighter hair, those things are afforded greater value and are considered closer to whiteness, further away from Blackness, and come along with privilege. Woke, I know everyone has heard this, probably more than they care to. Woke, what is an adjective that comes out of the African-American vernacular English, and it really means someone who is alert to racial prejudice and discrimination, someone who's aware of issues of racial and social justice. But we know that this word has been weaponized, and it is now used as an attack on people who are politically liberal. And that's something we'll be talking about in this course as well. And then finally, equity. Equity in contrast to equality, that's usually how equity is discussed. It has been seen as giving people what they need versus giving everyone the same thing. And one common example has been that equality is giving everyone a pair of shoes, equity is giving everyone a pair of shoes that fit. And that is one way of thinking about it. I, though, prefer definitions that really get to the systemic nature of inequity. And there's a definition that really resonates with me from the YWCA. And it says, an equity emphasis seeks to render justice by deeply considering structural factors that benefit some social groups and communities and harm other social groups and communities. Sometimes justice demands, for the purpose of equity, an unequal response. So it's saying the same thing, not giving everyone the same thing, giving people what they need, but it gets at the systemic perpetuation of inequity and dealing with that versus just, putting Band-Aids by giving people the pair of shoes that fit.
Can I just say one thing about Latinx?
Yes.
Latinx is actually generally applied to this, what do you call it? These continents, the continent South America and maybe Central America, whereas Hispanic does include people from Spain, just to make that finer interpretation. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to look at some of the barriers to deconstructing racism.
Before you leave that, would you define DEI for those who may not know?
Oh, sure. DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, there are many roles with that title in corporations and organizations, schools. So the pulling together of diversity, equity, and inclusion is a common title that is that many people have. Gail, is that what you were thinking of?
Sure, people, if everyone knows what DEI stands for.
Okay, all right, good. So of course there are barriers to deconstructing racism, and some of these can apply to any sort of problem you come across: avoidance, guilt, lack of awareness, fear, decorum, which I think is an interesting one, which says, you know, it's not polite to talk about race, or it says, I don't want to correct someone who makes a mistake. There's also indifference. There's fatigue and rejection. I created this list and then I thought of some others. There's making a mistake, fear of making a mistake. There can be anger, exhaustion, self-care. I can't even deal with it because I need to take care of myself. There are many barriers to being active in this work. And in addition, there are sentiments that can be associated with those barriers. And here are some on the next slide. So I'm sure we've all heard some of these. My family never owned slaves. I'm not privileged. We worked hard for everything we have. There's no such thing as white privilege. It's minorities who get all of the privileges. If it's truly systemic, I can't change it. All I can do is be a good person. I'm not racist. And white supremacy is a thing of the past. So I'm sure there are others. I was going to ask us to put some things in the chat, but I think we're pressed for time, so we're going to keep moving. But obviously, deconstructing racism is not an easy thing to do. Many groups and many individuals have spent their lives trying. So it's really helpful to recognize what we're up against and what are some of the factors that hold people back from being active in the work. And that applies to all of us as well. This is a quote from a professor. He's currently at Haverford College, but when I first encountered this quote, it was right around the time of the killing of George Floyd. She was then at Bucknell, but I use this often in my work. I come back to it, and I think it's very fitting. And this quote, "Building community requires truth-telling, bravery, courage, and grace." This effort takes work, and that work involves confronting myths and accepting and amplifying truths. And it really calls on us to step outside of our comfort zones, as was said earlier. And it also requires that we allow ourselves and others the space and the time to process and to grow and to change. So we're going to move on to some definitions of white supremacy. The first one comes from Layla Saad, who's the author of a book, Me and White Supremacy. White supremacy is a racist ideology that is based upon the belief that white people are superior to people of other races and that therefore white people should be dominant over other races. So this is sort of a common definition. It's similar to something you might find in a dictionary. And the sort of two notions of superiority and dominance are kind of the twin pillars of white supremacy. Moving on to another definition, Layla Saad's was focused on a belief system. This one is more, it adds the sort of important concepts of control and also the distribution of resources. So this one says, a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources, and in which white dominance and non-white subordination exists across a broad array of institutions and social settings. And this comes from Erica Wilson. She's a professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So this begins to get at some of the realities like wealth inequality. the fact that white Americans hold 84% of total US wealth, but make up about 60%, becoming less of the population. Or another statistic that the wealth of the richest 400 Americans is approximately equal to that of 43 million Black Americans. 400 richest Americans, 43 million Black Americans. So there's an enduring wealth gap, which will be discussed in later modules, that really shows no sign of resolving. And this is also a result of white supremacy. So here's one more definition. What resonates with me here is the breakdown of what it is and what it isn't. So it says a system or social order that keeps power and resources consolidated among white elites using an ideology that upholds whiteness as being the best or most normal. But then it says what it's not. It's not necessarily active hatred of people who are not white or active belief that white people should rule over everyone else. It's not limited to the most overtly racist fringe elements of society, as we talked about earlier. It's not a slur or an insult. It's not a historical artifact. What it is, it's the water most white people swim through without realizing they are wet. It's a basic fact of US culture and everyday life and a foundational truth of this country. So this next slide has an image that pretty much captures what was said on the last slide. White supremacy is ubiquitous. Even if there were no racists, no people who had racism in their hearts, no sharks, as this says, white supremacy would still surround us and would be the water we swim in. It would be like the air we breathe or the smog that infects our lungs. I've heard many different ways of describing it. But whatever it is, it makes our collective body, our society, unhealthy. And we can't fix it without acknowledging it. I'm going to just tell a quick story. Last week, I went to a talk and a woman about anti-racism, and a woman told me that someone told her they didn't have a racist bone in her body, and she said, and these were her words, "It ain't got nothing to do with your bones. It really is about the environment." So there are 3 truths that we hope you will take away from this course. The first is that white supremacy was very deliberately constructed over hundreds of years. It was backed by educational institutions, by the church, by science, flawed science. And it was an overt stated ideology that was institutionalized throughout our history. The second truth is that race is not a biological reality. And it's an easy one to dismiss because science has proven that, but it's a harder one to process and grasp, I think, for people. Race is a social construct, but it's one that has devastating consequences. And even though it's not based in biology, there have been attempts throughout history to suggest that there really is a hierarchy of human beings. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So finally, the last truth is just this understanding that white supremacy, it didn't end with the Civil Rights Act, it didn't end with the Voting Rights Act, hasn't been eradicated from our thinking even, and it continues to determine life experiences and outcomes. It's evolved into a systemic reality. So let's talk about the science. The science is clear. There is no Black gene, there's no white gene that's found in people who are considered Black or white or any other race. In fact, scientific research has determined that there can be more genetic variation within a race than is found from one race to the other. So more intraracial genetic variation than interracial genetic variation. Humans, the next slide will show, share 99.9% of DNA. All human beings then are 99.9% identical in their genetic makeup. So this is great to know, and we're really, I think, pleased. I think it's encouraging, but it doesn't solve the problem. But I did want to spend just a moment on the flawed science that contributed to the establishment and the entrenchment of racial hierarchy in our world. So, as I mentioned before, there were many attempts in the 18th century and the 19th century to prove that there were distinct races and that the categorizations held significant meaning. The prevailing view among European scholars was that the human species had its origin in the region, or of these scholars, not all, of the Caucasus Mountains. I'm not sure I'm even pronouncing that right. Apparently, that was where Noah's Ark was supposed to have landed, and people thought that's where mankind originated, and that's where white people were from. So it was first, Caucasian was first used as a racial category in the 1780s by a scientist named Christoph Meiners. And he wrote a book called The Outline of the History of Mankind. But 10 years later, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who ultimately became considered one of the founders of the discipline of anthropology, he introduced a system of 5 races that we're more familiar with. He did a lot of his study based on human skulls. He collected human skulls. Ultimately, he had 200 and some odd human skulls. He would measure the height of the foreheads, the size and the angle of the jawbone, the angle of the teeth, the eye sockets, the nasal bones, just all kinds of measurements to prove that there were these different races. And of course, he ranked Caucasian grouping higher than other groups based on the size of the skull and other factors. And what's really interesting, I think, is that it was so subjective that it became intertwined with this notion of beauty. So this is from Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, and I'll just read some of it. So there came to be known these group of people who were of the Caucasian variety. And he wrote, color white, cheeks rosy, hair brown or chestnut colored, head subglobular, I'm not even sure what that is, face oval, straight, its parts moderately defined, forehead smooth, nose narrow, slightly hooked, mouth small. The primary teeth spaced perpendicularly to each jaw, the lips, especially the lower one, moderately open, the chin full and rounded. In general, that kind of appearance, which according to our opinion of symmetry, we consider the most handsome and becoming. And this was applied to people from actually a wider range than those mountains, but people of Europe, Eastern Asia, as far as the Caspian Sea, and also those of North Africa. And one of his contemporaries, I just thought this was another interesting quote. Where shall we find, unless in the European, that nobly arched head containing such a quantity of brain? So it's interesting to read some of what they wrote, because they just, in my mind, conflated things. In addition to these measurements and what they thought was science, they're now talking about beauty, and that notion of beauty, became entrenched and persists to this day. All right, so here we see just some images of the skull studies, the measurement of the nose, facial features, and there's a video here that I'd like to share that I think settles the genetic question, but it poses another. Do people hear the audio? I don't hear
No,
it.
I'm not hearing it.
You have to stop sharing, go back and hit share again, and click the little box on the left, lower left that says share sound.
All right, and let's see how this goes. Back to the beginning.
Our species,
Better?
anatomically modern humans,
Yes.
are a young species with very little genetic variation. Would you like to know how little? We have less genetic variation than one group of Western African chimpanzees. Our species, in fact, really does not have biological races.
So humans present this conundrum. Science helps us in saying race, right, black, white, Asian, are not biological units. So how is it that humans can be so widespread and look so different and yet share so much in common? That's a huge challenge for science to figure out because that's not the typical pattern for mammals.
My job as an educator is to understand the ways in which race is real and the ways in which it's not real. It is a lived experience. It does have impacts on our biology, but it is not biology.
Americans routinely conflate socially defined and biological conceptions of race. They are not the same thing.
That's what's hard for people to understand, that these social constructs, these ways of being, these structures of history and politics and economics and health are very, very real, but they're not explained by our biology.
Science certainly has been responsible for some of the ideas that we have about race, about thinking about human difference, some that have particularly been damaging to many communities. So I think science has both a role and a responsibility in mitigating that damage.
Racial ideas have been at the root of so much discord in human history.
Their science was filtered through a racist, colonialist bias that they had doing the work.
The tragedy of our past racial thinking is that we have taken what are essentially superficial physical traits and we've imputed great significance to them.
So understanding the science behind human variation allows you to dispel the myth of race.
Now genetics have become a tool where we can explore distant relationships. It can upend the narrative and really cause us to question what we think we know.
When we dismantle racist concepts, it makes it a whole lot easier for us to be able to view other human beings as precisely that. People who have the same aspirations as I do.
Once you've dispelled the biological underpinning for inequality in this country, you're then faced with a political, historical, and social reality. And as a moral and ethical imperative, you have to deal with that. And that's why it's so hard to teach race and racism, because people don't want to deal with how messed up we are and how hard it is to get out of this hole we've dug for ourselves.
So I think that's why we're here, to get out of that hole we've dug for ourselves. I'd like to move on to a project to share with you. This is one of my favorites. This is a project by a woman who is from Brazil, Angelica Das. It's called Human Eye. The Human Eye Project is a photographic work in progress in which Angelica Das attempts to document humanity's true colors rather than the limiting labels, white, red, black, and yellow, that are associated with race. She, as you can see here, she photographs people and then she matches their skin tone to the Pantone color that closely matches them. And Pantones are the colors, that's a universal language of color that's used by brands and manufacturers to make sure that, you know, when you order something, you're getting the exact color that you intend, or for your logo or what have you. I mean, it's a universal language of color. So this project is in constant evolution. And she is seeking to demonstrate that what defines human beings is our uniqueness, and what defines humanity is therefore its diversity. I love looking at these pictures. I hope you will. It's a quick 1-minute video.
even if this work looks like in the first layer we are speaking about colors, I believe that the most important information that we will find in my photos is the lack of information. You don't know who is the poor, who is the rich, what are the sexual options, who is the migrant or not, who is the local or not, who has disabilities. The idea is celebrate what I believe that is the most powerful resource of our species, it's diversity. I start this global conversation to try to prove that with images that race is a social construction. If it's a social construction, maybe we can deconstruct this together through art.
So race is a social construction, not a biological reality, but it's a powerful social construction and one that impacts our lives. So let's just take a few minutes to reflect on the role that race plays in our lives. We have is this a poll or just, no, this is a slide. So we're gonna ask you to write down for yourself 3 ways that race influences your life, if you can think of 3. And Audrey, I think we were going to do breakout rooms, but do you think we have time?
Yes, I think we do, Nikki.
Okay, great.
While you're writing down your personal 3 items, we're going to put you back into your original groups where you introduced yourself with maybe one exception or 2. And then we're going to ask you to share those things. And it'll be interesting as you look around your circle and see the differences in the people there to see if there are any differences. Each room will have one of our committee members there to help you get through your discussion. And at the end of your time together, which will be approximately 15 minutes, we're going to come back together and we'll ask that committee member to share some of the trends or insights that came out of your group. I'm getting ready to push the magic button and you'll get the option to join from your screen and you will be back in your groups. For anyone that left or came in after we assigned rooms, no worries, I will get you into a room immediately. Have fun.
Sure. So we're exploring 3 ways race influences life. And it was a great conversation. So thank you to everyone who participated. We had from some of our white participants an observation of being given the benefit of the doubt and some of the assumptions that other people might make about us because we're white. And also some difficulty answering the question, maybe some awareness of, wow, this is maybe something that is not always so clear or obvious. And then some Black women shared, yeah, this is a narrative I don't accept. And I think one of my favorite statements was, I see this as, the stories are something that white people need to deal with, to address, to work with. And I'm not buying into it, and it's not part of how I see myself or my family story.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to group 3, Mickey Murphy, if you would.
Okay, I forgot I was going to have to do this, but some similar, I didn't take the notes, but some similar thoughts. One, this idea of privilege came out, of being given grace and opportunity, of being able to decide how to show up in a space. There was this idea of having lived a life that didn't allow exposure to other people. So a segregated life and not having, the relationships across racial relationships that might have been desired. There was this reality that it impacts every aspect of every day, and that it takes a toll. I think I'll stop there. Those are some of the ones that we.
Great, thank you. Let's move now to group number 2 and Judith Gaston from that room, if you'll share some highlights.
Yes. Some of the participants talked about the fact that being white was just given, that they weren't always conscious of the privileges that they were actually getting as they went through life. Some participants also talked about the fact that they had incidents where they were stopped by the police and they felt as if had they been people of color, the results would have been different. I'll stop there, I think.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Barbara, we'll come back to you and your group.
Okay, our group was very open, and the white people in the group talked about becoming aware of their privilege and their earlier lack of awareness of how serious or critical and deep-seated racism was until perhaps there was an event like George Floyd or somebody getting shot. And then I think the George Floyd one just opened a lot of people's eyes, and they became aware at that point. We live in two very different worlds, black and white. And let's see. There is some experience of, oh yes, not fearing the police and not fearing being followed around in the store. On the other hand, there were just 2 Black people in the group, myself and another gentleman. And we brought up, in contrast to not being afraid of the police, he brought up having to have the conversation, as you all know, about your behavior among police when you're stopped by police, to his sons. And the question of kind of why, I want to understand, several people said that, both black and white, I want to understand why is there white supremacy? Why do people think the way they do? And I guess we will get into that to some degree. And there was concern about how they would be perceived by white people in professional spaces. And also racial slurs. So I guess I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Well, this gives us an opportunity to see what all of the groups are thinking. Thank you guys for being candid, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mickey.
Yeah, I appreciate everyone sharing. And I'm so glad, Audrey, you said we had time for that, because that was pretty powerful. And I think it gives us a chance to think about it, to reckon with it, to reflect on it if we haven't done that before, but also to share some of those experiences with others. So I just want to thank everyone. We do have a quick 5-minute break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about some of the history of the legal underpinning of white supremacy in our country.
Once again, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. And this point that I wanted to make, and I was speaking to specifically our group, because I don't know how the rest of the group conversations went, but the thing about the white guilt thing, okay, that sometimes lends itself to hamper our opportunity to be able to share. Somebody got some noise in the background. That have opportunity to be able to share, and it gets in the way because of our experiences and our life, the things that we've lived, and our education. And so, we can't like beat all the white people up thinking that the race and white supremacy thing is, because I want to be able to listen. There's a lot of things going on right now that's affecting my children with CTR that's going into taking place. And I don't know if that stuff is coming here now, but I have to understand from the individuals who have in the position to be able to make those changes that's going to affect my kids. I cannot want this white supremacy to take place because it's already here. So I have to operate from the perspective of how can I function? I'm not accepting it, but it's been like this since 1865, and it's getting worse. But the people, like I said on this call, are not the problem, but they can help me understand how to help my kids. That was the point that I made.
Thank you, Clyde. And yes, we are here to be allies and to learn from one another, to share. So thank you for that. And in terms of it having been here since 1865, we're now going to talk about how it's actually been here much longer than that. So we share the screen again. We have, I think, established that race has no biological meaning. And so we want to now kind of talk about how it has been intentionally developed, even without that scientific rationale. So I think everyone knows that in the colonies, there was somewhat of a mix of people, and that racial hierarchy dates back to the very first days of, what would become the United States, starting, of course, with the dehumanization and the genocide of indigenous people. We all know that the first Africans came in 1619, and at that time they could have been really described more as indentured servants because their servitude was a condition, and it wasn't yet tied to identity. But they did share the bottom rung of society with white indentured servants who were mostly poor and ex-convicts from England, some from Ireland and Germany. But some of the early Africans owned property, were able to marry, and after they completed their terms of servitude, they were freed and had the status of free men. This, of course, was short-lived. During those days, the distinctions between the African indentured servants and the white grew. The planter class, the Virginians mostly, began having challenges with white disgruntled laborers. And at the same time, they had a demand for more labor, more free labor. And so that resulted in a greater reliance on African laborers and on the slave trade because they were easier to mark or identify. But anyhow, the growing numbers of disgruntled indentured servants, which were both European and African and indigenous, became sort of a management problem for the ruling class and caused some unrest. So in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon led a rebellion, and it was comprised of all of these groups, European, African, and indigenous laborers who were protesting against the planter class and the concentration of wealth in the hands of those elites and the harsh treatment by them. So this was a significant turning point in colonial America. It was a wake-up call to the planter class. They realized that in order to maintain the system of free labor that they thought they needed for their growing agricultural efforts, they would have to divide and conquer. So this is when the idea of birthright for European Americans came along, and they enlisted European Americans as supporters of making the Africans lifetime inherited people in bondage and enslavement. So this is when the new identity of white was formed, and it was applied to both the ruling class and the laborers. And this is when a system of differentiation in terms of laws began. The slave codes were any set of rules based on the concept that enslaved people were property and not people. And they all had certain provisions in common. All of them were clearly about color, that any, or at least heritage, any amount of African heritage established a person as Black, and that the offspring of the mother would inherit the condition of the mother, not the father. And this was so that the fathers could continue, I'm sorry to say, to rape and take advantage of the mothers, but that the children would continue to be enslaved and be also be property and be available for labor. So that is written up here in the Virginia Slave Code. In the Maryland Slave Code, the legislature said in 1664 that all Negroes are slaves already within the province, and all Negroes or other slaves to be hereafter imported in the process, so present and future, shall serve durante vita. hard labor for life. So anyway, we can see that the laws around chattel slavery were really the foundation of the social construction of race and white supremacy. Moving on to white skin laws, these really just, I'm sure you're familiar with some of them, that, no intermarriage, you could not whip a white Christian servant, but of course you could someone who was Black. It defined who could own things and be given provisions. I won't go through all of them given the time, but what it did was to give every white man, no matter what his station, a pride of race and an authority to enact violence against Black and Indigenous people without any fear of reprisal. And this was just very intentionally done by the wealthy and the political elite to keep them from uniting with the Blacks and the Indigenous people at the time. And this was the beginning of the entrenchment of white identity. So as we also know, membership in whiteness, or being considered white, is something that has evolved over time. There were obviously, privileges to being, membership had privileges. So the economic and the social gains that came with racial membership, makes it clear why over time, many European immigrants, such as Irish, Italian, and Polish, struggled to be accepted to be white in the 1800s. And as part of that, there was a need to agree to the subjugation of Blacks. So in order to be white, you had to get on board with that practice. So here we see some just ads from that time period. Whites only beyond this point, no Irish need apply, or, no Italians. This one at the top, they want a laundress, no Polish or colored. So everyone who is white today was not white at the beginning of the founding of our nation. Okay, that's in the, these examples are, through, I guess, well into the, 1800s and beyond, but just going back to the beginning of our nation, Thomas Jefferson, I think we all know, was a compromised, contradictory fellow. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Was written by someone who did not think Black people were fully human. And here are some of his words from Notes on the State of Virginia. I'll just read the first one. I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only, that the Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in the endowment of both body and mind. I have visited the Smithsonian Museum in DC and wondered why there's a life-size statue of Thomas Jefferson with bricks that have the names of his enslaved people around him. I just have not quite understood that choice. But this is just an example of how core this thinking was, even at the founding of our nation, even as we were writing statements like all men are created equal. So as our country grew and developed, the law really was an agent of white supremacy. The law constructed the system of white supremacy, codifying race as a concept in laws at the state level as well as the federal level. It sustained racial hierarchy, and then it allowed white supremacy to proliferate, because once we went from having race as a clear factor that would limit people's access and opportunity, when you move to colorblind and don't allow for any redress of what's happened over the 300 to 400 years, the same outcomes proliferate. So this all, I think, can be tied back to the law. The 1790 Naturalization Act, which comes after our Constitution is ratified, says that U.S. citizenship would be exclusively limited to free white persons. Only free white persons could become naturalized. And this Naturalization Act was in place for 162 years. It wasn't until the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 that changed. So throughout the 19th and half of the 20th century, naturalized citizenship was restricted to whites. This is something that I think people don't recognize or don't just never knew, never were taught. So we really don't need any other evidence that the principle upon which this country was founded and on which it was developed for centuries is the conscious and intentional ideology of white supremacy. Just to go back for a second, Kristen, I just wanted to mention these laws here. I was going to go through each of them. The Fugitive Slave Act, the Indian Removal Act, Greaser Act. Greaser is actually in the wording of this act in California. The Dred Scott decision, Anti-Coolie Act, the Convict Leasing System, the Chinese Exclusion Act. All of these are specifically, explicitly based on race and denying, limiting, restricting the rights of people based on race. Moving on, we were going to do a check-in and just see, we didn't do a poll for this. We were going to ask just, we did do a poll, or did we, Audrey? Okay. All right, we do have a poll. So although I had to kind of race through it, we're really just wondering, is this history that you knew, or is this history that, is something that, that you just didn't know as much about, or that you are, that you're learning more about today? And do you think this history is important for all Americans? Okay. Appreciate it. Thank you. So there's a range here. There's some who did not know this at all, some who learned it in school, some who learned it in school but are learning a little bit more today. And most people do think that it's important history for all Americans. I just want to fast forward in our last 5 minutes to current, to what's happening currently. There are, I think, many efforts to suppress or to take aspects of history out of curriculum. These are some headlines. These are all coming out of Florida. Teachers are subject to felony charges for teaching certain material. Florida bill bans businesses from making anyone feel guilty about race. And this idea that Ron DeSantis says Florida is where woke goes to die, that term woke. The next slide shows something I saw on Twitter just yesterday or the day before. 200 students in a town in Alabama walk out and protest after school administration told them that their student-run Black History Month program could not reference anything that happened before the 1970s, including slavery, the Black Panthers, or the Civil Rights Movement. This kind of censorship is really kind of unbelievable. This is one of the students who is involved, a quote from her: "Why am I being censored about my culture, something that is rooted in me? Why can't I talk about it? History is history, and it's already been made, and it can't be erased." Powerful statement from a high school student in Alabama. So we can feel outrage about what's happening in Florida and what's happening in Alabama and other places, but we can't be complacent. There's a book, a newish book out by Donald Yacovone, I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly, called Teaching White Supremacy. And he argues that this is nothing new, the suppression and manipulation of history. And he shows in his book how textbooks have always created a narrative to serve specific purposes, and that the history that's been in textbooks throughout, pretty much the 20th century, was meant to indoctrinate, to avoid talking about slavery. There was that one page on slavery, and the slaves were happy, the enslaved people, excuse me. It was meant to instill pride and a sense of American exceptionalism. And so he writes, the thousands of textbooks that have stained the minds of generations of students from the elementary grades to college were produced almost entirely by Northern publishing houses situated mostly in New York, Boston, and Chicago. And I put that quote just to say we can laugh at Florida, but I think we have to be, we have to recognize that this can happen anywhere. And I think everyone knows that the College Board recently released its curriculum, and they had sort of gutted it and taken out very important thinkers like James Baldwin and, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I mentioned earlier. I did go to their website and found that they have since written a very lengthy apology. So I think, I look forward to digging into that a little bit more. So I just want to say thank you. White supremacy is a powerful social, political, economic construct that really continues to have real consequences for Americans. Hate is taught. It's taught through textbooks, through omission, through suppression, and by a failure to acknowledge and confront really the continuing damage that the ideology of white supremacy inflicts on our society. So if we're to dismantle racism, we have to commit to confronting it. And I just want to thank all of you for being here to do just that today.